Okay, let's start this session. So, in the previous one, we saw that there is this PhD continuum, which is actually a multidimensional space in which your guide needs to take a position for a particular student, right? And we looked at the pros and cons of some of those positions, and you also did an activity to identify what is your position as a guide on that continuum, right? There are pros and cons of each position, and that's what we will be looking at later. Now, what we will do is we'll look at this aspect of alignment of the guide and the student's position. So, this is a predict the outcome activity. So, once again recall the continuum. Now, consider a guide whose primary focus is on their own research agenda. Okay. Consider student S who wants to work on an open-ended problem of their own choice. Now, suppose this student is paired with this guide for a PhD. Okay. Predict one outcome of such a guide-student relationship. Okay. Once again, we will go to Mentimeter and paste your responses. So, let me quickly show the question again. So, I see a number of answers that are saying there will be a conflict, student may feel suffocated, there may be unfruitful for both, student feels constrained. But there are also responses which say better research outcome and learning process, maybe a good output with frustration. Okay. Student will learn to align the research interests with the guide's fixed direction. Okay. So, these are again important responses that we are seeing here. If both are not flexible, then outcome will not be favorable. Okay. Expectation mismatch can lead to a state of friction. It may take too long to complete. S may be forced to align with the research agenda of G. Okay. Things have to be co-agreed between guide and student. Yeah, so there are a number of good responses which have come, and the point to note here is that it's not always a bad outcome. So, if we go back to this point, that some of us may have felt that, hey, look, this is obviously going to be a situation of frustration. But as we saw in the responses, it can also be a fruitful outcome provided the guide and student are able to negotiate and arrive at a mutually sustainable and beneficial position. Okay. So, if we look at that, we have looked at the responses. So, now if we look at what is the recipe for success in this guide-student relationship, this is something that we all are interested in. Okay. So, it is obvious that there should be a strong alignment between the guide and the student in terms of the position on the continuum and their temperaments. Okay. By temperament we mean that being systematic or being able to accommodate the other person's schedules and so on and so forth. Okay. So, in this case success is defined in mutually acceptable terms. So, the success may be academic in terms of research publications or getting a postdoc or a faculty position, or the success may be in personal terms in terms of being able to think broadly or being able to undertake larger projects, okay. Or it could be any other item which is mutually defined between the guide and the student. Okay. For example, when a student with high prior knowledge, skills and motivation joins a guide with a focused research agenda on a topic of mutual interest, right. So, the guide is focused on the research agenda and the student with skills also joins. Okay. So, in this case the student is likely to learn a lot, the student is also likely to do cutting edge research and get known in the field. The guide is also likely to benefit from the student's efforts in terms of pushing the boundary of the research and publications and so on. Another example is a student who wants to work on their own idea with high motivation, joins a guide with a highly flexible research agenda. Okay. This student is likely to learn a lot and become a strong independent thinker. Now here again, the guide is likely to get benefits from the student's effort, but these may be a little harder to quantify in the sense that it may be in terms of satisfaction and seeing the student's growth and so on. But as long as this success criteria is acceptable to both the guide and the student, I think the strong alignment between them in terms of the position on the continuum is a recipe for success. Now let us look at what is the recipe for failure. Okay. Obviously the opposite, that misalignment between the guide and student in terms of position on the continuum and the temperament. So now here it is useful to have an analogy. So imagine that the guide is being pulled by a magnet in a particular direction, which is their interest, their research direction and so on and so forth. Now along comes a student who is pulled by their own magnet in a different direction. So essentially what is happening in the situation is that there are different pulls pulling in different directions. So they are not aligned. Okay. So because of this, the chances are that it's likely to lead to misery for one or both parties, right? And as many of you also predicted from the activity, that it's possible that there is going to be frustration in such a misaligned situation. Okay. So now the question comes, how does one get out of this? So maybe when we signed up we did not know and then later discovered that there is misalignment. Okay. So the one recommendation for getting out of this is that from the guide's perspective, if the guide factors in the student's magnet, which basically means what is the direction in which the student's intrinsic motivation is going. Okay. If this is factored into any decision making about the project, then the chances are that the misalignment will reduce and will move more and more towards a aligned state. On the other hand, for the student also, it is useful when you find yourself in such a situation to align with the guide's magnet, at least temporarily, because that is a known route. So it may be that okay, you have a very strong inclination to work on your own, but your guide may know that that's not a very fruitful direction. So it is useful for the student to align with the guide's magnet, because the guide has much more experience in carrying out that research in that area. So even if it's not all that attractive, a temporary alignment will again lead to reduced frustration and more success for both the student and for the guide. Okay. So in general, before we are getting into aligned, misaligned kind of state, what are some general strategies that both the guide and the student can do? Okay. So it is desirable that the guide determine the student's inclination towards an open-ended or a well-defined research problem at the outset. So instead of focusing only on one's own needs of what type of student one needs, what skills the student should have, taking into account where is the student's inclination is a useful thing to do. Then the guide has to determine if the student has the skills to work as per their choice. Sometimes the student may have a preference but may not have the skills, or it may be too hard for the student to develop those skills within the time frame of a PhD. So once again the guide has to counsel the student and make them understand that they need to change their position to some extent. Then the guide can examine one's own ongoing research and see if there is a research problem suitable for the student. Okay, so the strategy here is not to look purely at one's own research area, but to look at the student and then look at one's research area to see whether there can be a fit. In a similar way, the student has to be aware of the guide's position on the continuum, okay, and the student has to be aware of the pros and cons of that position. Okay, many times students sign up without any awareness of the existence of such a continuum. Then the student needs to examine one's own interests and see if they are aligned with the guide's position in some way, or whether they can talk to the guide and negotiate that, okay, we will be aligned, because as I said in the beginning, the position is not a fixed position. So a guide might take a different position for different students. So that is where the negotiation has to happen to say, okay, this is what I want to do, and whether the guide is willing to align and whether the student is willing to align. So these are the questions that have to be discussed at this point. And then the student needs to develop the skills to work with that guide, right? So here the skills may be technical, such as the usage of some tools, or they may be non-technical, such as working systematically or being able to do independent work and so on and so forth. So the key point here is that the more the alignment, the greater the chance of satisfaction for both the guide and the student. Once again, we can have a 1-minute break here.